Welcome back, friends, to this video. Jennifer here, registered clinical counselor and trauma educator. And if you've watched the earlier videos in this series, and I hope you have, you already know that shame isn't just an emotion, that it's actually a state, a whole body state. It's a nervous system state, and it can shape how we feel, how we move, how we relate to others. And so today I want to bring in another layer of that. And I want to talk about how shame becomes habitual, how it becomes a habitual pattern in our lives. And a pattern not just in our thoughts, but in our posture, our breath, our muscle tone, even our expectations in relationships. And this is what's known as procedural memory. But here's a really hopeful part of this. Procedural memory is learned, which means it can be unlearned. So let's dive into that. Now, most of people have never heard of procedural memory. When we think about, what is memory? If I was to ask you, you'd probably say that memory is something that you can remember, like a favorite place you visited, your favorite restaurant, some major life event, even what you had for dinner last night. But that type of memory is called narrative or episodic memory. And it's our conscious story-based memories of what's happened in our life. But that's only one type of memory. There's actually other body-based forms of memory that are really significant. And one of those is procedural memory. That stores patterns of action, how you tie your shoes, how you ride a bike, and how you respond to stress. Procedural learning, it allows us to respond to things instinctively, automatically, and non-consciously. And that really saves us a lot of time in our daily life activities. There's also emotional memory. That holds more of the felt sense experience. For instance, how your body remembers fear or shame, even if you can't recall the specific events that led up to it or that caused it. So much of what drives our behavior, especially in the aftermath of trauma, lives in these non-verbal, body-based memory systems. They don't rely on words. Instead, they live in the nervous system, shaping how we move, how we relate, how we protect ourselves, and how we perceive the world. And this includes our emotional and our relational habits. And this shows up in some really specific ways. For instance, how we behave around others. You might find it hard to make eye contact or ask for help or express what you're feeling. That's not necessarily just shyness. It can be a learned survival response. When you have conflict with somebody, when something gets heated, you may default to things like blaming yourself, anger, dissociation without realizing why. They can be procedural patterns, and shame is one of those. Ways that we behave under stress, you might impulsively act out. You might withdraw. You might avoid people or connection. You might always say yes when you actually want to say no. Those are also related and protective patterns we've learned. Interpersonal behaviors. Maybe you tend to get too close, too quick to people. You become a caretaker really fast. Or you stay quite distant and avoid connection altogether. So again, these patterns are not encoded as conscious choices. They're automatic nervous system responses. They're learned ways your system learned to stay safe. These are procedural memory. And shame is one of the most deeply emotional and proceduralized responses we carry. So let's talk about how shame gets wired in that way. So we've talked about it a little bit in previous videos, but when we're little, our nervous system is asking one question over and over and over. What keeps me safe? And if it learns that expressing your feelings brought disapproval or punishment, if being too big, too loud, too joyful, too funny was met with shame, if setting a boundary led to someone you care about withdrawing or punishing you, then your system learned to suppress, to shrink, to hide. And it does it through your posture, through your very breathing, through your muscle tone. We shrink down, we get small. And if we do this over and over, it becomes proceduralized in our system. It becomes a habit that we lose conscious awareness of. and it becomes this automatic way of sitting, of moving, of walking, of not making eye contact, of lowering our voice. In a previous video, I talked about how the shame response is part of the dorsal vagal shutdown system, part of your nervous system. But it also shows up really clearly in our bodies, even when we're not in a dorsal response. It can look like having chronically slumped shoulders that leads to feeling bad about ourselves, a collapsed chest, a shallow breathing, a tight jaw, our legs pulled in, tension in our pelvis. This posture isn't random. It literally inhibits emotional expression. Think about it. If your chest is kind of collapsed, you don't breathe very deeply, it's very hard to feel joy or pride or excitement. Your shoulders are slumped down. We don't feel confident when we're sitting like this. You can try it for yourself right now. It is really hard to feel assertive if your shoulders are slumped down, if you're looking down or away. That limits our ability to feel safe and that we can connect to people. This is the shame posture, and it inhibits us even if we're not actively in a shame response. It's really where our body and our memory meet and live on a day-to-day basis. We're carrying it and our posture, our muscles, our physiology, even if we're not consciously feeling that somehow we're not good enough. So now let's add another layer, submission. When neither fight nor flight is possible, especially in childhood, your system defaults to submission, to appeasement. And this may look like, again, lowering your eyes, quieting your voice, saying sorry a lot when you don't need to. Basically trying to stay invisible. And of course it worked. It protected you. You're here. But it also trained your body and your brain to expect that staying safe means making ourselves small even as adults, avoiding conflict, anticipating other people's needs before our own. And of course, this shows up as patterns when we're adults, things like people pleasing, chronically freezing when we're around other people, judging our emotions as being too much, struggling to speak up even when we want to, not being able to access our healthy anger and be able to set a boundary. These are not conscious choices. They are essential adaptations that your system, your body learned to keep you safe. And so now that you can start to understand them, you can bring awareness to them in order to shift them. And igniting our awareness is key, because most of us not only carry shame, we also carry shame about our shame. We collapse and then we blame ourselves for collapsing. We freeze and then we judge ourselves for not speaking up, not asserting ourselves, not setting that boundary, not saying no. We fawn and then we feel like we can't really trust ourselves because we've done it yet once again. But my hope, my real hope here is that once you can start to realize that these are learned survival strategy, that self-blame, that self-shame can start to melt. What if instead of shame, you offered yourself the really true understanding that my body learned to do what it needed to do to survive? So now the big question is, are you wanting new ways of protecting yourself? Ways that are not shame-based, collapse, being small, sinking, hiding. Because the really good news about procedural memory is that it's not fixed. Thanks to neuroplasticity, your body and brain can learn new patterns through repeated safe experiences. That's why group work is so powerful, and that's why somatic practices are essential. Somatic practices they can help you reclaim the uprightness and the spinal length. It can help you expand your breath, feel your boundaries, reconnect to your core, feel your power in a safe way. You don't have to try and force yourself to be different. You just have to give your nervous system a new experience over and over until it learns that being confident, being visible, being expressive isn't actually dangerous anymore. Yeah, you can rewire, not by thinking about it, but by embodying something new. And one last piece I want to add before we close. Procedural shame, it doesn't just shape how we move, it also shapes what we expect from other people. And if we grew up expecting disapproval, withdrawal, punishment when you showed your true self, when you were open, when you were honest and vulnerable, you may unconsciously expect the same now as an adult with people that you meet. You might notice that you have a pattern of anticipating rejection, avoiding intimacy, not trusting when somebody gives you a compliment, staying guarded even though you know the person is safe. These can be big signs of a procedural map that your body is still running. But once you become aware of it, you can begin to interrupt it. You can learn to take breaths, to breathe into connection. You can learn to stand upright in your truth. You can learn to expect safety and recognize it when it's actually there. And you can learn to withstand the discomfort of taking risks, of taking on new challenges. So if you see yourself in this, if you recognize that you collapse when you really want to speak up, or that you try to make people happy instead of setting a boundary, if your shame feels like this is automatic reflex, it just won't go away. Really, I hope you can come away from this video knowing a few things. One, you're not broken, you've just learned some patterns. And two, anything learned can be unlearned. So drop a comment below. Let me know what you're thinking about this. Let me know one way your body has learned to protect you that you're now ready to change. We can create more awareness and more self-compassion together. Thanks for being here. See you again soon.